So thanks for having me back. It's really good to be here. I was here for a biocultural diversity seminar that Ursula and Gary and some others convened a few years ago. So the talk today is really an extended promo for a PDF that you can get for free on the internet. So the talk I'm going to give today is an article that's already been published, and rather than read that article, I'm going to just sort of try to tell stories. And what I want to do right up front is maybe frame some of the ideas, put it in context of this broader book project, Emergent Ecologies, that Ursula just introduced you to. But it is something of a wild ride. I mean, there's a lot of agents, a lot of critters. Capital is all wiggling in this talk. So before getting into those wild stories, I just want to. I'm going to read the abstract, which will hopefully give a little bit of the ideas that I'm going to slowly unravel today. So in part, this is a response to Latour, who has talked about the possibilities of bringing together a parliamentary democracy in the domain of nature. So his 2004 book, Politics of Nature, talks about this grand assembly where spokespeople, people who speak for other people, are brought together with people who speak for nature. So he talks about manufacturing speech prosthetics. So I'll introduce you to a frog that I tried to speak with and speak for. So I waded through the swamps of this place, Palo Verde, a national park, and I'll give you, show you how beautiful Palo Verde is. I'll talk about spectacles, both in a technical sense and also in a colloquial sense. But what I failed to find when I was wandering through these swamps, looking at agricultural lands nearby, even following the flight of capital.
I'm sorry, where is Palo Verde?
Palo Verde is in Costa Rica.
Okay.
So if you've been to Costa Rica, this is the Pacific part. This is like seasonally dry forest. So it's lowlands, it's very hot. There's lots of crocodiles and other forms of life. But this is the sort of vista you get when you show up. And I'm going to tell you how this vista was manufactured. But back sort of on the ideas and looking for this parliamentary assembly where people who speak for people and people who speak for nature come together, I failed to find an agora, basically a place where all these different people would assemble and speak. So in tracing some of these failed attempts to speak for other species, in particular the fringed-toed foam frog that I'll tell you all about, I consider how diverging values and obligations shape relations in multi-species worlds. As spokespeople articulated competing visions of nature on the borderlands of Palo Verde, there were multiple social and ecological worlds that went to war with each other. So very much all sorts of violences are embedded in this paper. The haunting specter of capital is really important to this paper. It animated the movement of cattle, grasses, animals with rhizomes, rice seeds, and flighty ducks across national borders and through fragmented landscapes. Amidst this warfare, the fringed-toed foam frog was just one tenacious parasite, a noisy agent eating at the table of another, which began to flourish in worlds designed with the well-being of others in mind. And with the parasite, of course, I'm invoking Michel Serres, who celebrates the polysemic nature of this word in French. Parasite both means a biological and social freeloader. It also means static on a television, and also means noise. So parasites have noisy interruptions. So in many ways, it's about this one species that's sort of flourishing in worlds that were designed with the well-being of others in mind. So cattails, charismatic birds, a multitude of insects began interrupting human dreams and schemes. There were no final solutions to the problem of living with parasites in Palo Verde. Humans and parasites who became paraselves of one another instead made an abiding presence in this landscape. So some of the stories I'm going to tell are going to unravel the ideas of this abstract. So maybe before I get to the spectacular landscape and the processes that produced it, I'd like to situate this talk within the broader book project, Emergent Ecologies. So part of what I'm trying to presence with that word emergence is the way that things like emergent diseases can destroy the order that exists. So it's not sort of an uncritical celebration of emergence, but very much paying attention to the ways that certain sorts of emergent phenomena are obstacles or destructive forces. So I talk about how some microbes are finding novel exploits, pathways of transmission, or modes of existence that can quickly transform dominant political strategies, economic systems, or agricultural practices. And some of those parasites that I'm going to talk about today are emergences in that sense. Emergences also figure into collective hopes. When a forest is clear-cut by loggers or destroyed by a volcanic eruption, emergent plants are the first ones to sprout. These nascent associations are able to exploit faults and fissures within established assemblages. They contain the promise of supplanting deeply rooted structures. These emergences materialize in interstitial spaces between divided forces. They disrupt ostensibly unified systems. False starts in one direction can become significant beginnings along a new vector. Flying in the face of long-term agendas, unexpected detours and happy accidents can generate a novel sense of order. So this broader book project, Emergent Ecologies, is a study of multi-species communities that have been formed and transformed by chance encounters, historical accidents, and parasitic invasions. It uses insights from contemporary philosophy to reframe key problems of conservation biology relating to invasive species, extinctions, environmental management, and reforestation. So the book follows the flight of capital, the trajectories of multiple species across national borders and through fragmented landscapes in the American tropics, again through Panama, Costa Rica, the United States, and back again. The central questions of the book are: how do certain plants, animals, and fungi move among worlds, navigate shifting circumstances, and find emergent opportunities? When do new species add value to ecological associations, and when do they become irredeemably destructive? When should we let unruly forms of life run wild, and when should we intervene? Instead of regarding the past as a legacy that should always be restored, I'm giving critical attention to the present interests at play in ecological communities as well as their possible futures. So now back to Palo Verde, this spectacular landscape. When many people show up in the tropics, they imagine that they're participating in time travel sometimes. They're thinking about places that are outside of time, outside of history, imagining a return to some past that might not have ever existed. But this particular landscape is very much a product of historical processes. So if you look out, you don't see these, you see a beautiful vista, but this was really shaped by cattle and capitalism. So during the late part of the 19th century and early 20th century, there were 20,000 head of cattle that were here in Palo Verde. And the key agent that animated the spread of capital into this landscape is a plant. And that's pictured, the seed of that plant is pictured up there. This plant is named Hyperrhenia rufa. It's an African grass. And what enabled cattle to penetrate these forests was the peculiar nature of this critter. So Deleuze and Guattari talk about rhizomes. Rhizomes are these underground stem-like things that spread, that evade detection, that suddenly emerge. If you chop up a rhizome and leave it for dead, it resprouts. These plants don't have rhizomes, but they have what Deleuze and Guattari might call animal rhizomes. They describe rats as pack animals, ants as embodying the sort of the functional principles of the rhizome. Those seeds pictured up there, that long hair-like thing, functions much like a flagella. So these grasses go to seed, the seeds drop down, they wriggle through the forest, they sprout, they catch fire, they burn the forest down, which enables the spread of capital and capitalism into new spaces. So this essay explores both cattle as the companion of capital. If you go back and look at the genealogy of capitalism, you'll find that chattel, I guess. I don't speak French, but I think those words are deeply entangled in the etymology of this word. So it's looking at how cattle, capitalism, and this odd companion species, Hyperrhenia rufa, sort of invaded, occupied this space, and enabled one assemblage that seemed like it would be there for a long time, flourishing. But basically, in the 80s, things began to change. I'm going to tell you about that tractor in a little bit. The Costa Rican government in the 1980s, in this really spectacular move, decided to take the land outside of capitalist production, or at least a big part of it. So there was a gringo ranching family, the Stewarts, that were largely in charge of this land. People talked about their land holdings not in terms of acres, but in terms of haciendas. They had 7 haciendas, which is just a phenomenal amount of land. So in the 80s, the Costa Rican government decided to take this land back and to turn a lot of it into a national park, which is what you get here, and to put a lot of it into rice farming. But what they didn't realize is that by taking this land outside of this extreme production system where you had 10, 20,000 head of cattle, that the very form of nature they were trying to preserve would disappear. So you can see a few migratory birds there. This is an actual rhizome of a cattail. So when they took the cattle out, cattails emerged. This is a native plant, and it's found throughout the world. Cattails have, in addition to these literal rhizomes that are more fleshy and interesting than the figural rhizomes of Deleuze and Guattari, they also have all sorts of chemicals that they secrete. So there's a chemical very similar to Agent Orange secreted by the root of this plant. So it basically kills all sorts of other forms of life and forms these monospecific stands, these big seas of plant. And that got in the way of the charismatic birds. You can sort of see a dim trace of them here that they were trying to protect. So when this land was in capital production, when the cattle were there, you would get flocks of up to 100,000 blue-winged teal, black-belly whistling ducks, which were visiting from North America. And these are the sorts of forms of life that conservationists love to protect. And there's a whole story about why that I'll get to later. It has to do with the Ramsar Treaty, this peculiar form of capital called socio-economics that I'm not going to tell you about yet, but we'll get to later. But this story is really about protecting a very particular articulation of this ecological assemblage that came to be manufactured by particular forms of capital. So as people realized that this vision of nature from the 1970s, the 1960s, with all these spectacular flocks of birds was going to vanish as a result of the changing nature of this place, they started retrofitting tractors with these big chopping blades and turning them loose in the national park. So they started killing these cattails by simply crushing them with a tractor. They tried all sorts of other means. They tried sending out machete crews. They tried introducing the cows back in, but the cows that they introduced to this place were afraid of the water. There's all sorts of crocodiles that live there. So in the levels that they tried to reintroduce them, it just didn't work. If you'd taken 10, 20,000 head of cattle that needed desperately water during the dry season and turned them back to pasture, that would have worked. But they only took a couple thousand, and they just weren't interested in going into these places. Cattle don't really eat cattails, but their presence in these massive herds will trample the cattails and make, this is all about creating a world for ducks, and they're starting to muddle through the different articulations of technology, the different natural cultural assemblages that they might make to keep those ducks in the world. So this is Gallo. He is a mechanic. He also hung out with the Stewarts in the 1970s. He has a lot of ABBA music on his wall, and he's really nostalgic for this particular moment. So if you ask Gallo or the Costa Rican conservation biologists who are in charge of this project, it's not about recreating the Pleistocene. It's not about creating this imagined nature outside of culture. It's about creating this nostalgic moment from their youth, 1978. So he goes around in this amazing orange Jeep, and he drives the Fangeo tractors. So Fangeo is a method usually used for rice cultivation. So these tractors were developed in another context to kill the rhizomes that get in the way of producing rice. But Gallo started using these tractors in a new way. So this is the moment they're trying to recreate. So David Stewart is the grandson of the original rancher, and David grew up alongside Gallo, sort of playing out in these fields as all the cattle hands were out there in the marsh, trying to make money and meat. So this is that moment, and there isn't a real good numerical representation of what nature was like at that magical moment. You just have reports like this. So in the dry season, there was a tremendous amount of birds, especially ducks. The sky would be black with them. It was incredible. Occasionally you would get professional ornithologists coming through, but looking back at the representations of bird life over the years, it's really sort of apples and oranges. You can't really get a clear vision other than what people report. So I left Costa Rica, where I first encountered this remarkable, spectacular landscape. And again, I'm using the maybe before we get to the Pacific Flyway, just want to unpack the spectacle for those of you who aren't reading Debord. So Debord talks about spectacles in human worlds. He talks about how looking at an image basically unites an audience while dividing it. The alpha and the omega of the spectacle are separation. So when we're looking together at a common image, we're not looking at each other, we're not talking to each other. We're also not thinking about the social and technological mediations that went into producing this image. So the same sort of reading of the image might be applied to a landscape. Regarding these places as spectacular, or flocks of ducks as spectacular, is asking one to think about the both multi-species labor relations that went into producing this, but also the biotechnical articulations that go into producing such an image. So people are basically experimenting with ways to produce that spectacle. So the political economy of this image is super complicated and unexpected. Anna Singh has invited us all to play the game of global futures, and she means this in sort of in a literal way. She has created a game where you're given images and a secret mission, and you're asked to describe coalescences. So in her game of global futures, she describes the coalescence as the contingent coming together of two things that basically causes a becoming, causes something to change and shift in the world. And this story that I'm about to tell about the flight of ducks and the flight of capital across national borders is one of those unexpected coalescences. Who would have thought that this remote part of Costa Rica was being remade by the long arm of what one scholar, David Wesley, has termed socio-economics? So Ducks Unlimited is an organization based in the United States that prides itself as being the very best at wetland conservation. They claim to have bought up more land, more wetlands than any other conservation group in the world. And basically, this project I encountered in Costa Rica was an attempt to make a duck factory. This is their terms, not mine. The original duck factory was the prairie pothole region of the United States, and in addition to Ducks Unlimited, you have other groups like Delta Waterfowl going into these places and making it a utopia for ducks, killing things like raccoons, weasels, foxes, things that eat duck eggs, things that would be potential predators. And this model, these articulations of capital and multiple forms of technology. I don't have time to describe the amazingly interesting and bizarre hay bale blinds that you can buy, the decoys and the ways that you can learn how to speak with and for ducks by making calls. But this basically was exported into Costa Rica. And the two places, the place where I encountered Ducks Unlimited in Northern California and Costa Rica, are linked by this actual geographical thing, the Pacific Flyway. So ducks are routinely migrating back and forth. So what they're trying to do is produce more ducks in Costa Rica so that they fly back to the States and so that hunters can kill them. This is how they generate money for conservation. I went to a Ducks Unlimited banquet in the honor of Gary Lease, one of Donna Haraway's colleagues at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Donna and Gary had taught animal studies classes before. Gary was my principal interlocutor on all things duck. He was then the dean of humanities, and he sat me down on an elephant stool that he had, an elephant leg from an animal he had killed in Africa, and preached the gospel of Ducks Unlimited. And he said, as with any gospel, it's worthy of a critical hearing. Gary died during the course of my research. He had throat cancer, and this banquet that I attended was in his honor. And like other banquets of its kind, they had a 60-gun raffle. So they had 60 shotguns that were being raffled away, being given to all sorts of people. One of the ways that they raffled it was people at a microphone like this, just asking people to buy tickets, and they put them in the thing and reach in. Another was ducky dice. There were all sorts of games of chance that people were engaged in that I really didn't understand, but other people clearly and it derived a lot of pleasure from them. So it's sort of the coalescences, the unexpected coming together of these worlds that I'm trying to characterize in this multi-sided, multi-species way. So who would have thought that playing ducky dice in Northern California could shape the articulations of sovereignty, nature, and culture in this remote part of Costa Rica. So here's sort of an image that encapsulates what's going on here. You can get a visa, Ducks Unlimited visa, so every credit card purchase you make will channel more money into this strange articulation of capital, ducks, and technology. So let's go back to La Tour a little bit. So here's some of those ideas I tried to introduce at the beginning. I was trying to study this parliament where he imagines this great political assembly where both representatives of people and representatives of nature are coming together, and it's this kinship that he's trying to describe. So politicians are doing the representing of people, scientists are speaking for nature, and in part I think it's his call is an opening up, asking science and technology studies scholars to build these prosthetics that give voice to non-humans, saying that we should both question the representations of nature that scientists are making, but also try to make new ones and playfully experiment with making new ones. So it's with these ideas in mind that I returned to Palo Verde. In 2006, I participated in an expedition into the wetlands late at night with crocodiles all around, with leeches trying to get in my pants, with water scorpions trying to sting me. And I participated in this project with graduate students who were trying to speak with and for the fringe-toed foam frog. It's a small little frog. It's really hard to spot. If you approach it, it stops calling. So you basically have to go out there with these knee-high boots, slowly wading into the water, holding a microphone, recording the calls, and then after we took those recordings, we played them back to see what response we might get. So initially, everyone was super excited. They thought that they had a finding that could be reported in a scientific journal. So it's been well established that other kinds of frogs will pretend to be bigger than they actually are to try to get the ladies. So with bufo, it's a genus of frog that's found throughout North America. If you record one of their calls and digitally modify it and make it appear deeper, which correlates with a bigger body, that's going to both attract more female frogs and also shut up the other male frogs. They stop calling. So we tried to do the same thing. So we recorded these frog calls, digitally altered them, and then played them back, both at a higher frequency and a lower frequency. And what we found is initially that the frogs were basically communicating capitulation. When a bigger frog showed up, the smaller ones would say, it's okay, you can come. But it all actually turned out to be, okay, here's what it looks like doing research with fringe-toed foam frogs. That's Craig Geyer, who was the principal investigator on the project, as well as a bunch of graduate students. And we're there like trying to listen and also play back. Do I have, okay, this is a spectrograph, what the sounds actually look like. But basically after a lot of playing with the spectrographs and the statistics, it turned out to be an artifact of sampling. The effect that we initially saw fell apart when we got a bigger sample size. So there was a moment when it seemed like the fringe-toed foam frog would have legions of scientific spokespeople, people who were able to interpret their call and articulate it to conversations in biological theory about sociality, about the nature of conflict, the nature of reproduction. But when it fell apart, the fringe-toed foam frog was orphaned from these conversations. It never got articulated into this Latourian parliamentary democracy. And basically, instead of legions of scientific spokespeople, instead of having PhDs written about it, all the fringe-toed foam frog got was little old me. So people abandoned the spectrographs and went dancing to merengue instead. And you could hear the fringe-toed foam frogs quietly calling to themselves in the background as salsa and merengue were playing. So basically what I found is that this amphibian, even though we weren't able to speak with it or speak for it, was quietly enjoying the ancillary benefits of a world that had been designed with the well-being of others in mind. So this was again a duck factory, a utopia for one form of charismatic life that this tenacious parasite was enjoying. Here's an established assemblage, an articulation of nature, capital, technology, an emergent world that had been that this parasite was very much enjoying. So again, if we're thinking about the parasite as this noisy agent, here is something making noise that cannot be interpreted, something that cannot be brought into our networks, our parliamentary structures, happily living in this world. So that doesn't mean that the Parliament of Things necessarily fails. Stingers, one of Latour's close colleagues and critics, says that this idea of the Parliament of Things belongs to a utopia. It's nothing more than an empty dream if it does not function as a diagnostic vector for what makes it a mere utopia. So the fact that I did not find an agora when I went to California, or as I was wandering through the swamps, or wandering onto agricultural lands nearby, that means that we should be thinking critically about the forms of reality that are actually there. It's not that we necessarily need to build this utopia, but think critically about how these ideas are failing in productive ways as they bump up against the ethnographic richness of the world. So cattle, it turns out, even though they're not good at killing cattails, have been welcomed back into this national park. They're basically continued companions in killing of a reforestation project. So in Palo Verde, there's the wetlands where we have the fringe-toed foam frog, the cattails, and all the ducks, and then the drier parts of the national park where this grass, the one with animal rhizomes that likes to resprout and catch on fire, is a tenacious parasite, a plant that's getting in the way of another re-emergent world, the forested ecosystem that was destroyed by cattle and capitalism. So it turns out these very same agents agents of destruction have now become companions of killing and companions of care that enable this emergent ecology to come back into being in the aftermath of cattle capitalism. So the ways that the biologists talk about the presence of the cattle is in terms of these Pleistocene extinctions. So this is a picture of a gomphothere up there, something that went extinct around the time that the first humans showed up in Central America. And it turns out that certain plants, like the one pictured down here, it's sort of related to a calabash. It's got this super big hard fruit that requires something very strong with big teeth to bite into it. Those plants had been orphaned by these Pleistocene extinctions. So in addition to killing Hyperrhenia rufa, to cutting back these invasive African grasses that are getting in the way of certain kinds of forested ecologies, the cattle are actually cultivating communities of trees, caring for orphans, that helping trees like this one achieve the same density and population analogous to what they had in the Pleistocene. So it's this unexpected articulation of life forms from elsewhere that stand in as surrogates for species that are now gone. So beyond this utopia for ducks, at the same time that national park was created, a utopic scheme for workers was also created using some of that same cattle land that was taken away from the Stewart family. So in this utopic moment in the 1980s, the Costa Rican government decided that they wanted to definitively bring to an end a certain species of parasite. So Michael Brown has written about landlords as the parasite. The landlord in Latin America is the one that sort of takes, always is taking the lifeblood of the people. And Michael Brown has a classic article written in the 1980s in Cultural Anthropology about how people are in these precarious modes of existence, not only because of these species of macroparasites that he characterizes as the landlord, but also microparasites, diseases like malaria, dengue fever, amoebal dysentery. So in the 1980s, the Costa Rican government had this utopic vision. In addition to taking that land outside of the land that had been used by the Stewarts to produce capital, to produce beef for export, to just make these gringos rich, in addition to establishing a national park, they wanted to make for livelier articulations of livelier articulations of capital with agricultural production. So the movement that led to this political moment was called the precariaristas. They were basically these rabble-rousers, the proletariat, who were agitating for land on the front lines against cattle capitalism. And this moment came to be. They took the land from the Stewarts and parceled it out to people who would grow rice. So here's a picture of Gerardo Mesa out in his rice field late at night. So the people who were brought into this rice farming scheme had been doing other things. They had to learn really quick how to grow rice. So the first, I'd say like 5 to 10 years were utopic. The rice yields were really good, but then new species of parasites began to emerge. So you had all sorts of homoopteran insects that would come in. You had rats that would come in, multiple species of insects, all sorts of fungi that began to come into the rice fields. And in response to those biological parasites, new human parasites came in. There were all sorts of predatory lending schemes by both insurance companies as well as agribusiness companies that came to sell a diversity of toxic products. I think there's one that I happened to encounter during my field work. Talcord is bottles that I found. So basically farmers were getting into debt. Every year brought new debts, and people were gradually entering into these cycles of dispossession. As the ducks initially, crashed in population, that correlated with the good years for the rice farmers. As they started coming back, the ducks became a species of parasite for these farms. So if you go to Palo Verde National Park, if you kill a duck and you open up its gut, what you find is that 97% of the food inside is rice. It turns out that they like the open water where there's no cattails, where there's water hyacinth, other floating vegetation. That's a great place to sleep during the day. They like the big expansive open water because they can see predators coming from afar, but they're not really eating very much in this national park. And their current flourishing is because of this Borderlands, the national park existing alongside of the rice fields. So they sleep in the park during the day. They're nocturnal, and at night they come to rice fields like Gerardo Mesa's. So right here we're out at night basically watching the field to make sure that there's no ducks. And that tiny little light you see in the background is a Welch's grape juice can that he's put a little kerosene wick in. And he goes around creating these little pretend villages with lights that scare off the ducks. It's illegal to hunt a duck in Costa Rica, so the duck factory that's producing this spectacular form of nature to be consumed by hunters in distant places like California is producing this social and economic inequality on a local scale. So socio-economics is in direct competition with these other forms of lively capitalism. It turns out some of the visions of conservationists are also complicated in this frontier, this borderlands that Gloria Anzaldúa has described. Gloria Anzaldúa's bilingual book, La Frontera, Borderlands, describes places where the first world and the third world grade against each other and bleed. And that's very much what's going on here in this village, Bagatsi, that borders Palo Verde National Park. And it turns out that at least some of the charismatic species that the biologists are focused on producing are doing a lot better in rice fields. So here we have a picture of a Habaru stork. That's the most endangered bird in Costa Rica right now. At certain points, I think the breeding population was down to 24 pairs. I never saw one of these Habaru storks in the national park, but in one day, Daniela Marini, an Argentinian biologist who was working with me in Bagatsi, she saw 14 Habaru storks in these rice fields. So very clearly, they're doing well. And interestingly, what they're eating right here are fringe-toed foam frogs and other critters. So the fringe-toed foam frog is basically this tenacious little parasite that's hopping between the worlds, enjoying the ancillary benefits of worlds designed with the well-being of others in mind. And again, that's also a Fangeo tractor, the same tractor that's being used to make the duck factory nearby in the national park. So as these multiple species of parasites, some human, some non-human, are driving the farmers into this increasingly precarious state of existence, you have another articulation of capital that's competing with rice farming. Mexican rock stars and former Costa Rican presidents have invested in sugarcane companies and imported laborers from Nicaragua. So you see one of the laborers down there. You can't really see the mask on his face. But basically, these bodies are being exposed to the very worst sorts of chemicals. There's a doctor that comes by about every month or so, and he told me about all the cases of poisoning. There's quite a lively literature written by the conservationists about the impacts of the rice farming chemicals on the national park. But in all my literature searching, I couldn't find a single study of the impacts of these chemicals on human bodies. So people are gradually being driven out of these villages. The sugarcane companies are coming in, and there's a law that says that the farmers can't sell these lands. This is a law that was built to sort of protect this fragile articulation of small-scale holders who are supposed to cultivate rice in these plantations. But these companies have found a way around the law by assuming the debts of the rice farmers, making the debt payments directly to the agribusiness companies that have lent them the money to buy the toxins, and then making a very nominal payment. So basically people have left the village and have gone to the city, and you just have these migrant laborers who are coming in. Interestingly, the sugar cane also brings with it other parasites. Rats in particular are flourishing in the cane fields. Those rats then go next door to the rice parcels and are part of the forces that are eating these farmers out of house and home. So I went into Palo Verde during my last visit with an empty water bottle, and I filled it with water both from the national park and from these rice fields. And in the rice fields I could hear fringe-toed foam frogs along with all sorts of other amphibians quietly singing to themselves outside of these parliamentary assemblies where they might be represented. And I think for this image, I'm just going to start reading a little bit of my concluding thoughts before opening it up to discussion. So Bruno Latour's ideas about speaking for nature initially led me to imagine scenarios for bringing democracy to the swampy hinterlands of Costa Rica. Scenarios where rice farmers in Jaragua grass, cattails and foam frogs might command spokespeople on equal footing with those who speak for ducks. So sort of a more just world where it's not only the ducks that have very powerful spokespeople, but a multitude of agents. Graduate students from the U.S. routinely visit Palo Verde Biological Station. There's these courses run by the Organization of Tropical Studies that bring students down every year to get trained in the fundamentals of tropical ecology, and they've maybe taken some of these sorts of political critiques on board and have earnestly attempted to speak for the cattails that are being killed by the tractors and for the multitude of creatures living in their shadows. They tried to build what Latour would call speech prosthetics to add new voices to the chorus. They've assembled diverse technological devices into networks. The students have worked to make neglected species participate in what Latour calls the articulation of a common world. One group of graduate students found that open water where the cattails had been crushed was comparatively lifeless. Large animals such as turtles and aquatic rodents were being killed outright by the chopping blades of the tractors. There were more beetles, flies, true bugs, water fleas, rotifers, isopods, and other crustaceans, mites, snails, caddisflies, and nematode worms in the stands with cattails when compared to open water. So something that looks like a homogeneous stand to an anthropocentric, picturesque vision of tropical nature actually turns out to be quite a lively assemblage. And in addition to the stuff that they were able to see, I took these water samples and worked with a confocal microscope in Santa Cruz to produce images of unloved others, orphans of the ecosystem that were beyond their ability to render these forms of life visible. The speech prosthetics of these graduate students were fragile. They only sampled 6 sites in open water and 5 sites in cattail stands. Senior scientists and residents at Palo Verde Biological Station never conducted a follow-up study with larger sample sizes to track the populations of these organisms through time. Instead of trying to create a democratic assembly, a unified parliament of things where all creatures of the wetlands might one day be represented, the park officials were being moved by oblique powers. Amidst competing visions of conservation and agricultural production, shifts in these oblique powers were determining who lived and who died. Latour's actor network theory orbits around the work of human entrepreneurs who enlist other agents in common worlds. Envisioning the construction of an ever-expanding parliament, Latour proposes making agents articulate a single collective, defined, and ever-growing list of associations between human and non-human actors. Latour's broad category of the non-human betrays an anthropocentrism at the heart of his parliamentary proposals. Non-human is like non-white, in the words of Susan Lee Starr. It implies the lack of something. Creatures like the fringe-toed foam frog that refuse to participate in anthropocentric collectives are living figures of post-human hopes. Living and dying in zones of abandonment, these organisms are in an epistemological space beyond the reach of scientific measurement and direct biopolitical measurement. Here's a picture of my favorite frog. Even as aspiring scientists earnestly work to democratically speak for nature, struggling to build stable speech prosthetics for a multitude of unloved critters, I found constant evidence of constitutive outsiders. I discovered species that were ever elusive, unloved others who were unrepresented in realms of human discourse. Returning to Gerardo Mesa's parcel late one afternoon, I found fringe-toed foam frogs calling to each other in rice fields and in drainage dishes of sugarcane fields. So they were doing fine, whether it's the duck world, the sugarcane world, or the rice world. All of these aqueous microenvironments of agribusiness were awash in chemical toxins. Following my first contacts with this tenacious amphibian, after working with biology graduate students who failed to make it speak to semiotic theories, searching for its noisy din in unexpected places, I found it flourishing. In this landscape that had been blasted by multiple waves of capitalism, I came to understand these frogs again as living figures of hope. Fringe-toed foam frogs are listed as being of least concern, according to the IUCN Red List of Endangered Species. They are flourishing in a time of extinction, figuring into emergent ecologies. Constantly switching from one element to another, these ontological amphibians are hopping amongst environmental worlds, running wild in La Frontera, the borderlands where capital is warring with itself in a schizophrenic dance. Living as a parasite in the world designed for others, fringe-toed foam frogs are generating a noisy cacophony, refusing to speak to anthropocentric concerns, invading and occupying agricultural ecosystems flooded with toxins. The wily nature of the fringe-toed foam frog offers a potent reminder of the limits of human knowledge and forms of representation. In the words of Jean Rostrand, theories pass, the frog remains. Thank you.